Sometimes the unthinkable happens. Sometimes the terrible thing, the world-shaking thing, the thing that you didn't even really fear because you thought it was so unlikely it couldn't ever happen to you, happens to you. That's life in this world, right? You and I have lived through times where something happened that shook our world to its foundations. Maybe you remember living through September 11th, 2001. And not just living through the terror or the fear or the grief of lives that were lost, but feeling like there were certain things you thought didn't happen here, didn't happen in a country like mine, in a place like mine, and all of a sudden the safety you thought you could count on was shaken. Maybe it happens when a diagnosis happens to somebody that you care about, and all of a sudden your plan for how life was going to go gets thrown out the window. Maybe there's a tragic accident and somebody that you care about is suddenly taken out of your life. Maybe it's a life-changing move that's going to pull you across the country and change your job and your life and everything like that. Maybe you're living through one of those times right now. The difficult thing when we find ourselves in a situation where the unthinkable happens is so often our thoughts go to questions to God, about God, and there aren't easy answers. So often when the unthinkable happens, when your world gets shaken, whether just you and your family, or it feels like your whole community, maybe even your whole country or the whole world is turned upside down in ways you do not like, you find yourself asking, where was God? Why would God let this happen? And if you've been there before in your life, if you were there right now, it's worth naming that question forms on our lips. And I think for a lot of us, our default assumption is that it's God's job to prevent the bad things from happening, or that's sort of how we imagine what religion or what religious faith is that I get the list of things I'm supposed to do, my end of the deal. I keep the commandments, or I pray, or I go to church, or I look religious, or whatever. And if I do those things, then God's job is to prevent the bad things from happening, that God's job is to stop the unthinkable from happening. And it's real easy then to assume that when the unthinkable does happen, that either God made it happen because God's punishing me for not doing my side of the list well enough, or God's punishing us because collectively we didn't do enough, or that whatever does happen must have been God's will. That's what God wanted. Jesus, however, approaches things differently. In fact, Jesus doesn't just show up when a bad thing happens as the guy to explain it, but rather Jesus preemptively prepares his disciples for when the unthinkable will happen for a lot of them, many of their own lifetimes. There's a scene we're going to explore this coming Sunday from Mark's Gospel, where Jesus and his disciples they're in the capital city of Jerusalem, where not only the ancient palace had been back in the days where they had kings, it was where the Roman forces occupied, and where their seat of power is. It's where the temple was, and they happen to be around the temple, and Jesus' disciples are just in awe of these big, beautiful stones that are the foundation of the temple. And it's sort of a testament to them of how permanent and immovable and eternal the temple is, and the grandiosity of it all. And Jesus' response is, look, these stones aren't going to stay in put forever. There will come a day and all of it gets pulled down, when everything comes down. In other words, Jesus is saying there will come a day when the unthinkable happens, and Jesus' disciples are scared out of their minds, right? Their assumption is, but Jesus, we bet our faith on you. We assume we're betting on the right horse, and your job is to stop the bad things from happening. Your job is to prevent the unthinkable from happening. And Jesus doesn't necessarily think that when the temple comes down, when it will be destroyed, that it's a matter of God making it happen, like sending a lightning bolt down. Jesus almost really sees it as, if the people continue on their course of action, it will set into motion a chain of events that the empire will respond to by cracking down and destroying the temple and destroying Jerusalem and ending so much of life as they knew it. Jesus doesn't seem to lay the blame at God's feet as though God is sitting up in heaven waiting to throw lightning bolts. Jesus turns back to the people and says, you're on a course of action that is going to lead to the temple being destroyed. And I'm telling you in advance, when the unthinkable happens, here's how we'll get through it. Of course, it's uncomfortable, but important to know that Jesus is right, and that within a generation, within 35 years of Jesus saying it, enough people within Judea, enough people within the Palestine where Jesus lived, listened to the voices of religious zealots, listened to the party that was looking to overthrow the Romans violently and take their country back in the name of God, that they provoked a Roman crackdown, and the Romans did come marching in and burned the city down to the ground, pulled down the city walls, destroyed the temple. Jesus was right. The unthinkable happened, and it changed things forever for people who lived in that time, including probably some of the early Christians and maybe even some of those first apostles of Jesus who had lived through that point. Jesus says all this not just as a warning, as if they change their behavior and are well behaved enough, the bad thing will never happen, but more to say, when it happens, I want you to understand, we'll still find a way forward. God will lead you through. In fact, Jesus uses really interesting, beautiful language for what you do when the unthinkable happens, what you do when your world gets shaken, what you do when the thing you thought was so unlikely that certainly that will never happen in my lifetime or where I live or never will affect me, when it comes to your front door. Jesus says, don't be afraid when all of it happens. These are birth pangs. Birth pangs are a certain kind of pain, aren't they, right? This is not like when your appendix is about to burst, that's bad news, or when, say, you have a kidney stone, also bad news. Birth pangs imply pain that is involved in bringing a new creation about, bringing a new life about. Jesus is convinced that exactly at the point where everything that we'd held dear falls apart, and it happens, God is prepared to begin new creation. That's important for us to hear because, again, like I say, sometimes we assume God's job is just to be the guarantor of the status quo, that God's job is to keep things as they are, and if we do a good enough job being good little religious boys and girls, God will keep things as they are for us, when that's never been God's job description. Jesus says God is the one who brings new creation, and so when the world feels like it's shaken, when it feels like the unthinkable has happened and you don't know what to do, Jesus doesn't offer a 5-point plan for how to fix things and make them go back the way they were. Jesus instead says, here's what you need to hope for. God is doing a new thing. God is bringing about new creation. Sometimes that means we get through the unthinkable. Sometimes that means that everything we'd built our lives on gets thrown upside down. Sometimes it feels like the bad guys win and the Romans destroy your city. Sometimes it feels like there's just no control and everything's in chaos. Jesus' response is, when those things happen, and they will, we trust that God is able to make new creation. So if that's where you are right now, this is a moment for us to hear God's promise to make new creation. And that's what we're going to hear this coming Sunday as we delve into this passage from Mark's Gospel. So we invite you to join us for worship on Sunday. And you and I, we will all bring with us all the baggage of those times when our world had been shaken and we wondered what to do or where God was. Come this Sunday so we can hear Jesus tell us about the God who makes all things new, even when everything else has fallen apart. There's a place for you here on Sunday. See you then.